So, we'll have people here to listen to me talk about how to talk to a lawyer. So full disclosure, I am a lawyer. Probably people figured that out because it's very empty here, but I think normally we do not bite. We're not harmful, we're not dangerous in that sense, so if you want, feel free to move up ahead. So, who am I? My name is Ahlberg. I work in the open source program office of Ericsson. I have a background as a lawyer. I've never really worked at a law firm, didn't seem to be the thing for me. So I spent my career working with various open source matters within Ericsson, from its patent department to doing things related to M&A and now with the CTO office in the open source program office. So if you ever want to talk about legal matters relating to foss, or now you're not so scared of me, that's great. So if you ever want to talk about legal matters, I mean, either speak to me directly, send me an email, first name, last name, @ericsson.com, or look me up on LinkedIn or whatever. Happy to talk about open source, legal matters, or technology, either way. So what's actually my job? Partly, I'm a lawyer for the company. I'm the guardian of sort of Ericsson's intellectual property assets, in terms of code, patents, and so on, but those things are really no good unless we actually turn them into value. So that's where the gardening parts come in, where we can take our assets, put them into an ecosystem, and create some value from that, either as open source or standards or sort of things in between. Also acting a lot as a translator between my colleagues in the legal department, people in engineering and business management, and trying to get them to understand the kind of weird thing that is free and open source software and why it makes sense for us to do certain things, and why this is not as scary as it might sound. I also view myself as a cultural anthropologist. That's a very hard word, so I'll try to explain it. Cultural anthropologists are those people that basically they study how a culture interacts with society and how that forms a society and interacts with nature around it. Typically, they would be the people you would think of that go into the Amazon, live with an Amazonian tribe for 12 months and sort of study their culture and how they work. I'm not so adventurous myself, so I choose to study software developers instead. That's the tribe I chose to study. Here today I'm in the traditional warrior garb of the software developer, with the hoodie, jeans, t-shirt, rather than the cultural garb of lawyers being suits and ties. I much prefer this myself. So this is kind of my life. Day 17, I've earned their trust. I'm the dog in this picture. So the talk I'm gonna have today is partly based on an article myself and my envisioned co-presenter, who unfortunately couldn't be here, gave, and it's about sort of efficient IP management and viewing sort of open source through the lens of intellectual property and how to manage open source efficiently, and introducing the Open Chain project as sort of a framework to do that. The first article, when we submitted it, they told us this is great, but it's about 8 pages too long. And we're like, okay, so can you shorten it? So that was the first article. And if you want to read the full thing, where no one put restrictions on us, this is the QR code for that. So, as I said, I work in the open source program office of Ericsson, and the way we view it, it's like all supposed to revolve around 3 C's. It's consumption, because consumption needs to be simple. It needs to be simple and low cost to introduce open source into our products. Otherwise it will not happen, or it will not happen in the right way. And we needed to follow the process, because otherwise we have sort of zero control of what we have, and that creates, as we heard in the previous talk, it creates issues from a CRA perspective when we get there. It will create sort of license compliance issues for on the open source side, and we'll talk a little bit about scale later, but really to be able to scale that, you need to have automation in a lot of this. It can't be a very manual or heavy labor process to introduce an open source component. It's also about contributing and enable both big and strategic projects and engagements that sort of with hundreds of engineers engaged in one way or another in the project, but also the enabling small upstream bug fixes and coordination. And that's going to be, in our view, even more important in a post-CRA world, where we quickly and easily need to close a lot of CVs. And also open source compliance. Following the licenses is not a nice to have, it's a need to have. It's absolutely fundamental that we're able to do this. And it so happens that to have a good open source license compliance, you also kind of need to have all the stuff you need for security anyway. So it's cross-pollinating. Like it's basic hygiene. You need to know what did my developers use. And if you know that, you can build on security and you can build on license compliance from there. Ericsson is seen as a very closed company in terms of that, but I would say these days, like some products are at more than 90% if you buy lines of code. 90% of those lines of code are open source. In some products it's lower, some product lines are probably below 70%, but I would say on average we're at 80%. And that's sort of, in my experience, is fairly standard for the software industry at large, and we're no different. What might be interesting is sort of the volumes of open source that we consume in Ericsson, where so it's been an almost exponential growth of open source components. And when I say open source components, to clarify, I mean either something completely new that we haven't seen before, or a new version of something that someone requests to bring in. And last year we brought in about 32,000 new components. And to be able to do that, we need automation. We can't sort of have manual handling of features. It needs to be automated as much as possible. This does not include, this is just top-level dependencies. It doesn't include, sort of, if you dig down deeper into the stack to see what each components depend on, it's just a top-level thing that we brought in. So in reality, the number is far larger what we have and what we need to manage, right? So we've gone through this curve. I think it's probably the same for a lot of companies in terms of, you see open source technology supply, it's finders keepers. Then the sort of, at least for us with Linux, we realized, oh, there's no such thing as a free lunch. We need to be part of this. We need to contribute here because not doing so is also a cost for us. And then sort of to where we are today, we are more in the join-up stage. We are actively participating. We see open source as incredibly important for our continued technology leadership. And open source is not a supply, it's a partner. And I think that's key to think about it that way. And to get the company to think about this, it's not a supplier that you can place demands on or require things from, it's a partner that you need to work with. And the more you put into it, the more you will get back. We also, of course, work in standardization. So we're going to continue to do so. For us, they are complementary regimes. Some things work great in standardization that wouldn't work in open source. Some things work great in open source that would never fly in standards. And for us, we kind of need both of them. So getting back to the lawyer talk, this was just like, why should you listen to what I have to say? And then building some credibility on that part. So open source awareness at legal. So first stage, denial. We don't use open source, right? And you'll come to realize that we're using it, and we're using a lot of it. Typically what happens is that you enter the second stage, stage of anger. Like, this is a huge risk. Why have no one told me about this? Who is bringing in this open source? Well, it doesn't really help to be angry about it. So you'll enter the bargaining stage, walking down to engineering saying, can we please not use open source? No, we won't be able to ship a product. Or if we did, it would be so expensive that no one could afford to buy it. So no, we're not going to stop using open source. So what's left for a lawyer to do? Repression. True. Of course, we all know that businesses are using this, so of course that's not true. Repression is not the final stage. This is based on the 5 stages of grief, by the way. So you enter into the acceptance stage. Okay, we just need to be smart about it and develop processes and strategies for managing this. And that's sort of the way to do it. And hopefully what this talk will do is sort of help along the way to get to this final acceptance stage. But to be honest, I think sort of all of us, sort of in any sufficiently complicated matter, you constantly bounce back between depression and acceptance. At least I do. Because you figure out something, oh, I haven't thought about this. We're screwed. But then you figure out like how to solve that. And for me, at least the most recent case was Gen AI and introducing Gen AI into our products. And it's like, this has implications on open source, like going back into the depression stage, but then figuring out, well, it's just more of the thing that we always been doing. So back to the acceptance stage. Sorry, that slide. So what is needed to build understanding? I mean, we need to be speaking to each other in a way that both parties can make sense of. So to put this in a way, like, we need a frame of reference. We need to point to where is north, right? We need to agree on that. And we need to have a cultural understanding of each other. We need to understand, why do we care what north is? Like, I could point in an arbitrary direction, it doesn't really matter, right? No, there's a reason, cultural reason why we care what is north. We need to understand business and risk. So why do we care what is north? Again, but from a different perspective, not just cultural, it's also about managing the risk and business aspect of the company. And finally, we need to understand why we both want to go north. Like, what is our shared goal as an organization? So I'll get to that, but I think legal, if you have either outside tech legal counsel that you work with, or within your organization legal counsel that you work with, they are really your ally. They want the same thing as you want, believe it or not. They want to reduce risk. That's how they see it. The things you guys want to do in terms of security, in terms of open source license compliance, in terms of contributing back, that's also all about reducing risk for the company. But you need to sort of have this common understanding to be able to see it the same way that you share the same goal. You just have slightly different ways of going there. What you will end up with, or could have, is sort of the conversation with lawyers. Like, we use how much of this open source stuff you said? Like, oh, it's that much. Okay, that's going to be scary for a lot of them, because their question is going to be, who signed that license? You tell them, no one signs these licenses. You download the software, that's how you accept it, right? And that's, for a lawyer, that's typically a fairly strange concept. These click-through licenses, or that someone not authorized to sign agreements on behalf of the company have accepted these license terms and conditions, and that's now in your products, and determining how they need to act. Another thing that's typically strange for lawyers is that there's typically no governing law in these licenses, meaning governing law means that, like, which country's law should we apply if we have disagreements about this license. Like, typically, if you look at sort of any other agreement that you would sign, it would point out, this is the country's laws that we're going to use. This is the court of law that we're going to go to. Basically, no successful open source license has that. Probably the least successful open source license ever was written by Ericsson, the airline public license. It was a great license from a lawyer's perspective, because it had these things. It said that, it's the laws of the country of Sweden that applies. And if you have a disagreement, you solve that in Stockholm Municipal Court. Great from a lawyer perspective. Not so great if you're sort of an open source developer. It's like, I don't know the laws of Sweden, I'm not going to touch this. Or even if you are a lawyer, but you're not familiar with Swedish law. If you're a US lawyer, you look at this like Sweden, I don't know if that's sort of the country with IKEA, or if that's the country with the Cocoa Pots and chocolate. So I'm not going to touch this, like, my developers need to touch something else. So paradoxically, like, it's great to have there, and it's the first thing they teach you in law school, but it doesn't work in the context of open source. And then the other question is, like, can we negotiate with someone about it? If I don't like these terms, like, yeah, for some small maintainer projects, yes, you might be able to do that. You might be able to purchase a proprietary license, but for many other projects, no, there's no one to negotiate with. It's a project. It has so many different copyright holders that no one could grant you anything differently. And why would you even want to negotiate this? It's just standard terms, right? So, in the absence of all of this, what we might need is maybe an engineer to lawyer, lawyer to engineer, translator. So let's see, if we punch in here to our translating engine, we punch in source code. Let's see in engineering language. Let's see what the lawyer hears then. But first of all, sorry, I'll go back to this one. The lawyer here, copyrighted material. That's lawyerish for source code, because that's what it is. And typically when I explain this to my lawyer colleagues internally, I'll use this slide explaining what is source when I try to explain what is open source. And I find it's typically useful to try to explain to them what is source. So I have this poorly drawn picture of a computer screen, and on there we display LibreOffice, and I say, okay, that's the graphical user interface, that's what you see. But that's not sort of what's behind that. And this is broad oversimplifications, right? This is the source code, that's what's behind. And this is just HTML code. But it looked very coded when I did these slides, so stuck around. Okay, so engineer will say source code. Lawyer will interpret that to here. That's copyrighted material. Because it's a creative work created by a human, sometimes worthy of copyright protection. Okay, but in the context of like this is copyrighted material, I can understand that. That's a frame of reference that the lawyer can understand. Because that's the same as any other, if it's a painting, if it's a book, or if it's a screenplay, that's copyrighted material. We understand, lawyers understand how to transact those, how to protect those, and how to collaborate around those. So as soon as you abstract beyond like its code, it's very complicated and say, no, it's just copyrighted material, same as any other. It has some special aspects to it, but fundamentally it's just copyrighted material, and you understand well how to deal with that. Let's do a few other examples. So open source software. What is that? Sort of lawyer translation. But for a lawyer, that's a third-party IP dependency, because we depend on this IP, this copyrighted material, that we have not created. We have not entered into a special agreement with a second party to procure this. It's a third-party IP dependency that we have. And of course, as with any, if you have an IP department or a patent department, they will understand the need to manage their third-party IP dependencies. And when you put open source like that to them, that changes the conversation. Because all of a sudden, like, oh, this is something we're using, we're not controlling it. But then we absolutely need to understand how we manage this asset, because it's super important for our products. So let's do another one, open source license. We all understand what that is, right? So for a lawyer, what's that? That's a standard template contract. Like, very simple for a lawyer to understand. They have those all the time. It's like, we're not going to write, sort of, if you, as a tenant, are going to rent an apartment, you're going to get a standard template contract to sign. Same here. You want to use this open source software, well, it's a standard template contract. You don't negotiate those, right? So, engineer says, I want to have an open source license compliance program because I don't want to be in violation of the GPL or the Apache license. So, sounds good. Business management might say, that sounds expensive. Why should we do that? We're not getting sued today. Well, what the lawyer should hear is reducing risk in a systemic manner across the company. And that's what you, ultimately, you want to do right by the copyright holders, by the open source community, by following these licenses and doing what's required of you, and releasing source code when that is required of you. But for a lawyer, that's just, okay, we're following the licenses. If we set up a program around that, if we put rules around that, that's just a systemic way of reducing our business risk. And that's great, because we don't like risk. So now I'm switching it around, so now it's the lawyer saying something. What will the engineer hear? So we have copyright owners. Okay. So copyright owners, for engineer in this setting, what would that be? Well, that would be open source contributors. Those are the other open source contributors in this project. They are also the copyright owners, unless they sign that away, but that's a special case. So a lawyer might say, well, you're going to collaborate with all of these people to build something together that's going to end up in our product that we're going to rely on to be able to sell this product going forward. Do we need collaboration agreements and non-disclosure agreements in place? What the engineer will hear is like, no, we got the open source license and no NDAs. Doesn't work like that. We work in the open, right? So you control, the NDA part you control by determining what you put out as open source. That's how you can control the non-disclosure. That's on your side. But you don't enforce that in a project. Okay. Okay, business owner then. Making money in terms of open source? Not really. Saving money, I would say. Because typically, there are some companies that make money on open source, don't get me wrong, but that's not the typical business case. Typically, why you use open source is that it's the best way of collaborating for software. It's going to save you money in development costs. But putting it that way, both to business owners and to lawyers, like, well, this is really about us saving resources and leveraging the fact that someone already put thousands and thousands of hours into this project. So let's just use that to save money rather than building this from the ground up. And of course, like, if you're saying as an engineer, saving money, well, what will management tell you? What will they hear? They will tell you, we love you. So business management should love open source, at least from the perspective of it saving them a lot of money. So, my very smart lawyer friend that I texted a copy of one of the slides, and I said, like, hey, what do you think of this? Is this a good way to go about it? And then I asked her, like, do you have any of these that confused you when you got started out about these terms? And then she's like, I got so many of those. They're mostly technical though. And I'm like, please go, send them. All right. And then, like, in the span of two minutes, she sent me the things you were confused about: stack, parse, patch, fix, compiling the code, refind your distribution. Do you need more? I was like, oh, I think I'm good. Just, can I use a screenshot of this conversation for my presentation tomorrow? And she was like, sure, but it's going to cost you the slides. I want access to them. I'm like, fine, fair trade. We'll go with that. So a little bit more humorous. So when the engineer says AI, what does the lawyer hear? I work with the devil, put on this earth to make my life much more complicated, but it does generate very nice income flows.
That's an accurate summation of AI, or at least the modern stuff.
Yes, but it is true, because AI makes sort of the legal landscape so much more complicated, and it's more of a headache for the lawyer to deal with that. If we look at, for example, AI-generated code, and the fact that there's no copyright attached to that, because copyright can only be held by or created by humans, how do we deal with that as lawyers? Because all of a sudden we have a huge chunk of our products we can't protect, or that there's nothing enforceable about. I think that's an interesting question. Another one is that a lot of these Gen AI coding buddies will output snippets of open source code. And how do you manage that from a compliance perspective? It's incredibly complicated. And we could probably spend, well, the rest of this presentation talking only about that. But I think we're going to try to move on. Okay, so without an engineer-lawyer dictionary or translation service, what do we already have today? We need to have education, we need to have patience, and awesomely boring stuff like ISO 5230, i.e. OpenShame, which is a open source project developing standards. The two standards it has currently is one for open source license compliance and open source security best practices. So when set a common goal, if you want to work with legal teams to sort of help you in your open source operations and be your biggest supporters in this, have a common goal. Let's start with easy stuff and align on, such as license compliance, because lawyers want to reduce risk. Open source license compliance is all about reducing risk and doing the right thing. So once you have that in place, and once you have them cheering on and sort of and I've experienced this and seen this in multiple companies, if you get the lawyers on your side saying, we really need to have this in place, it will happen. And it's no sort of coincidence that a lot of OSPOs in companies that haven't for a long time originate with the legal department or with the IP department, because those were the people that cared about license compliance and reducing risk, and that's where a lot of OSPOs started from. And then we realized, well, once we have license compliance, there's other things we need to do, like contribution, like fixing intake, and so forth. But a lot of it started from license compliance. So that's actually a great way of starting to building these bridges and building these relationships, and start both training yourself to sort of facilitate between engineering and lawyers and be this sort of translator. But it's also a great place of starting to build competence in the legal department around open source. And sort of once they get over the hurdle of this is software and really, really scary, and on top of that it's open source stuff built by people with long beards and hoodies that I don't understand. Once they get over that hurdle, they will realize, well, a lot of these licenses, even if they're not sort of good contract or good legal text, at least they're clear, at least there's relatively few of them used with any regularity, and you can extract the terms and conditions from them fairly easily. Then sure, there's uncertainties in some of them, there are things not mentioned and so forth, but still, compared to a lot of the other agreements they are faced with, this will be a breeze. As soon as you get them over that hurdle, you'll be like, this is not so complicated after all. Maybe I shouldn't say that, because I lived my entire career as a pretty mediocre lawyer on, actually, being the only one understanding this. But from that, you can also build out to address things like the EU Cyber Resiliency Act and get them on board with that. And if you really want to become popular with them, ask them a difficult question like, will the EU Cyber Resiliency Act force us to rethink how we draft our R&D collaboration agreements? Or how we draft for customer exclusivity, because the CRA will contain obligations for us to upstream code occasionally. And if there's an exclusivity agreement with a customer, we might not be able to do that if they own all the copyright in what we develop for them. But we might still be forced to upstream that. Or for that matter, like how do we work with procurement to ensure that your suppliers are CRA ready? Because probably they have writing in their contract about following all applicable laws every single time. Well, it doesn't really help unless they are sort of CRA ready already, right? Come due date, if they're not ready, they're going to be faced with two choices. Either they're going to lie to you and to the Commission and say, yes, we have the CE mark, you're free to use this. And then they run the risk of high fines, and that's not anything we should encourage. Or they're going to say, well, I'm probably going to pay the fines that's in my agreement with you because I'm not able to supply you this part. But either way, you are pretty screwed, to use plain language. Because in the first case, it means that you are including a component with the wrong CE mark, and that's shall we say, frowned upon, to say the least, because then you have not done your due diligence. Or it means that you don't have this component put in your product, and then you can't deliver to your customers. And that's why it will be way more expensive. So getting your supply chain ready for that. And I think that's another great way of building bridges, because I don't think that's necessarily something that would be on the legal department's radar. It's that from our part came up from security and from open source angle that we need to address this systemically in our legal work as well. So these are great things to start building bridges around. If you look at sort of, this might be familiar to some, at least those working with or in or with an OSPO, the OSPO maturity model. And essentially, like you have 5 stages here of the maturity of an OSPO, from adopting open source ad hoc to the leadership of becoming a strategic decision-making partner. And my slide isn't as nice, but I would say the same 5 stages exist in the legal department as well. Because the first stage is you establish the legal department, then draft legal strategy, address risk systematically, provide legal education, then so as the final step, you become the strategic decision-making partner for the organization. And so the more mature your legal department is on this ladder, probably the easier they will be to work with. Because if their biggest hurdle is like we need to stop signing agreements, willy-nilly and just get a hold on things, like open source is going to be pretty low on their agenda, but if they sort of have the basics in order, then sort of this is a good thing to address. So the lawyer solution with open source is that the legal department is your ally, because you do have a shared goal of reducing risk. And one of you actually wants to put out the product as well, but you both want to do it with a low managed risk. And getting them to the point where open source is here to stay, they need to deal with it, it's something they will have to learn about, or find someone that already knows about it. And the more mature the legal department is, the easier this conversation is going to be. So, a great way of reaching maturity, and I'm biased because I'm deeply involved with this project, but it's the OpenShape project. And a quick guide to that is, it contains a number of very basic elements that sort of you should have in place if you want to do license compliance. And this is a great way of sort of having this framework to talk with your legal department and setting these things up, that sort of explaining things to each other on how the respective things work. So you need to have an open source policy. That's one of the things that the OpenShape standard says. that you need to have an open source policy. It will not dictate what that open source policy should be. I mean, a valid interpretation of that is the open source policy says don't use open source. That would be a pretty bad open source policy, but it's a valid interpretation according to this standard. But typically, working with your legal department to determine what should that open source policy be, what do we allow and what do we disallow, and getting the understanding that, well, probably we can't have company-wide rules for most things because it's going to be dependent. Is this a cloud product? Do we distribute this? Is this only an internal tool and so on? It's also about have the staff receive training related to open source, and that should be done regularly within the certification period. Do your company have compliance processes covering inbound, i.e. open source software, so that you know what you bring in? If an engineer says, I want to use this, do they know what they are supposed to do? And you have that in place. Again, the standard doesn't say what the training should be, it doesn't say what the compliance processes should be. That's all that we were saying. Do you have these things? If so, great. And compliance processes for internal development. When they want to use open source in development, do they have that in place? Then, is there a compliance process for outbound products and services, i.e. when they're going to ship something? You know, is there a compliance process to check that, yes, we have checked the boxes for open source, we know what's in there, we know what we're going to use. Do you have a process for outbound open source contributions? Again, it doesn't say that you have to be super restricted or say no open source contributions allowed. Just that, do you have a process for that? A good process, for example, is, well, if it's just a bug fix, don't ask me. That's a good process, good and simple. If it's more of a feature growth, okay, maybe we should have a conversation about this, if this is something we want to do, or if you have sort of prerequisite business owners sign off on this, like simple processes, but have a process for it, because if you don't, that have a way of creating uncertainty and doubt in the organization. Am I even allowed to do this? Am I even allowed to do open source contributions upstream, unless you have a process saying, yes, you are allowed, and here's how. I prefer a very simple process. We don't have a very simple process, but I would prefer one. And then you should have documentation for all, how is all of this done? How is all of this applied, right? You should have documentation for that. And that's actually very basic. It's probably a good thing to have that documented, so that it's not just based on go ask Gunnar, and then Gunnar wins $1 million and quit the company, and then you have no processes left. So document these things. And then what this also creates is a uniform approach towards open source compliance artifacts. I.e., like if I'm talking to a supplier and I ask them, are you open chain conformant? And they say, yes, we are. Okay, great. Can I see your documentation for all of these? Can I see your open source policy? Can I see your contribution policy? Can I see your compliance process? And then we can have an intelligent conversation around that, and we can exchange these things more simply. Or in the context of an M&A, it's like, are you open chain certified? If they say, yes, all right, great, then let's have a look at all these things. It gives great clarity, it saves a lot of time. And if they don't, it's okay, give me the delta. What do you have, what don't you have? And that's a great way of asserting risk in these scenarios. And this also has the beauty that it has such a boring thing as an ISO number, which is really great because legal departments and especially procurement department take ISO numbers very seriously. They understand like, oh, it's got an ISO number, then it has to be very important. It's also a lot easier to get that into, for example, a procurement contract or a process when you refer to this is the standard you should follow. We don't have to negotiate about exactly how you're going to do it or what's going to be included here. It's just there's a standard to follow. So we touched upon this, but let's go over it again. The lawyer's issues with open source. It's scary. Like, I don't understand this. How many people here have heard the term, I'm not a technical person? I tell my team, that's not a valid excuse. It's neither is it a good nor it's a valid excuse. I'm not a very technical person either. I struggle to turn on my computer in the morning. But that's not a valid excuse. It's like, and if you get that, I'm not a technical person, I would say it could be an indication of a failure of both sides. It's a failure from the engineering side to really, go down at the fundamental enough level to be able to explain things. And it's also a failure on the lawyer side to really understand these things, because none of this is new. Lawyers are great at facilitating collaboration. How do we work together? What's the frameworks for that? How do we protect IP, i.e. copyright? How do we transact that copyright? How do we enable these things to happen, right? And that's what open source is about. But because we put this sort of software layer in between, it suddenly becomes very scary. But these are things that most lawyers, even mediocre ones like myself, are actually pretty good at facilitating. There is a difference in mindset and culture, and this often comes down to, so this often comes down to the fact that they don't understand the business model of open source. They see we're giving stuff away for free. That's bad, right? That's bad economics. No, not if you're getting something in return. But what you get in return might not be immediate. It might not be quantifiable. So taking the time to explain, like, why is it more expensive for us to have our own internally maintained fork, and why is that growing more expensive over time? And why can't we just, don't fix what's not broken and stay with this old version of the software? Like, take the time to explain the fundamental economics of that. It's one thing I find important. As there's sort of slightly different missions here. Like, engineering wants to push out great products, right? That's what we want to do. Legal also wants us to do that. Otherwise, we're not getting paid, and we like getting paid. But we want to do it with our mission is to push that product out with as low risk as possible. It's not that we can get to zero risk. Everyone realizes zero risk is unachievable. But aligning on the mission of like, okay, so how do we make it as simple as possible for us to develop a product with low risk? And it's also a fact that copyright is notoriously hard to manage as an IP asset, because it's not registered. If you write something on your computer, that might be copyrightable if it reaches a certain creative height. That's not a very high height, but still. But how do I even know about that? There's no register I can go look at. There's no registry of all the copyrights my company owns, because it's created by my employees every single day. And there's no register to do that, so it's hard to manage. But fundamentally, maybe it's about we speak different languages. And it's not that I think we should invent a common language to have like the Esperanto of the open source world. That's not what I'm going for. But at least, like, when you go to a foreign country and you learn a few key phrases, like, that's useful to facilitate things, and that will help you speak and understand more effectively. Sorry, we're gonna skip over a few of these. So, addressing these, talk a little bit about it, but like, you address the scary part with education. You address the culture thing also with education, and sort of clearly explaining the value of open source, that you share an ultimate goal of delivering this product with good margins and a low risk, and that you have common values and an interest in making this business successful. Why should you use OpenChain sort of as a starting point? Well, it's a community built around it. You have some of the world's largest companies being part of it, such as Ericsson, Huawei, Siemens, Bosch, Volvo is certified towards it, Mercedes, Cariad, and you have sort of this whole community of not only automotive, not only finance, not only telco, but the entire software industry is aligned around this specification for how you do license compliance effectively. And they're a helpful bunch of people. It's go there, ask questions. Everyone is happy to help, and it sort of gets you from the talking stage of like, oh, we don't understand what we're going to do. We need to reinvent. We need to invent all this. No, we don't. Let's talk and just do it. And it's all predefined for you, and it creates a instant credibility in the market that, oh, it is this standard that we recognize. We now roughly know where you stand on this. Good. You don't have to do it alone or all at once. It's a process. It's gradual improvements. We are improving, maybe not every single day, but at least every single week we're doing something a little bit better. in terms of this, then I think that should be the goal of continuous improvement. So with that, we can move into some questions if there are any. One over there.
I'll bring him back. Sure. If I can turn it on.
Hello. Hello. So thank you so much, Jimmy, for your talk. It was actually really great. So the main thing that I joined, I've had issues talking to lawyers before, and I really liked your slide about, it was called the open source awareness curve. I don't know if you want to show it, I have it on my phone. So my problem is that it doesn't look like a curve.
I have so many slides.
Yeah, it's somewhere in the
backwards.
Yeah, there. So
right.
Exactly. So my problem is that it's in my experience, of course, I haven't talked to super many lawyers, but where it's not a curve, it's more like a circle. So it stops at the bargaining stage and it goes back. So we never get to move on. So I don't know if you have any feelings or tips about this, how to overcome and move on from that stage. Thank you.
So I can provide some thoughts free form. And first of all, I love the fact that you sounded genuinely surprised that you like my talk. But good, I managed to sort of exceed expectations, that's good. No, but I do think it's unfortunately like a little bit dependent on individual. Like if you find the right individual that you vibe great with, then it's easier. But I also would probably try to push this together with CRA, because like CRA will force you to pass this hurdle. It's like you can't slide back. You need to pass this, because the alternative is like if you don't figure out CRA and figuring out open source and the legal side of open source, it's going to be crucial to be able to conform to the CRA. And when they're faced with like, I either figure out this thing I'm not really comfortable with, or we don't sell products in Europe, I think that's going to be a fairly easy choice, I hope. So I would try to push it up either on a specific use case, like the CRA, or like, look, we're using this, we're not sure if this might be a legal risk for us unless we figure this thing out. But that's unfortunate, sort of like the best I can give you.
Thank you.
So.
Very good talk, thank you.
You didn't sound surprised.
No, this is brilliant. A few slides later in there, you talked about third-party IP something.
Yes.
There, IP dependency. That made me think, if a business actually is involved in an open source project they depend on, would it be meaningful to call those projects as second-party IP dependencies? And make a point out of that, so that we don't just leave them into the group of others, where we have no influence, but rather say that this is actually projects that we care about and that will influence the success of our business. If they have a bad day, we'll have a bad day.
Yeah. I could not have said that better myself, and yes, that's very much the point. As soon as you join up, you take some ownership of this. It's now like a second party, because like that project is now sort of a partner to you in the same way as a supplier would be. But unless you're actually actively contributing to that, I would say you don't really have that status of the second party dependency. Then it's more of a third party, like you don't control this. It's just in your product, right? The same if you have a patent that you don't have a license for, you maybe don't even know about it. That's a third party IP dependency as well. And same here with like if you go further down the dependency tree, you'll find it's like, oh, we didn't even really know we had that. That's also a third party. But maybe the analogy breaks down a little bit in the details, but I still like the phrasing, and I very much like your take on it, that it's about shifting this up to a more the second level that's more actively managed.
Could we just start using that phrase, always, so that we get management and lawyers in on it, that there is a scale here that we should be aware of?
I'd like that.
Yeah, that's good.
I'm not surprised, Jim. This was a really good presentation, but I expected no more from you. I heard you before as well.
So it's not achieving on expectations.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. You can tell
Well,
in salary negotiation.
if you can answer-
evaluation.
If you can answer this, I'll raise my judgment. We both love talking about the CRA because it's new and it affects open source directly. Your customers at Ericsson are seriously affected by these two. How would you place these two in this perspective with your work?
Also super important, and to be honest, it's something I understand less of. One of the reasons I like talking about CRA, as I told Henrik, is I don't know much else, right? So if I'm going to sound intelligent, I have to talk about CRA. Otherwise, it would be sort of me rambling about something I don't understand. But I do think NIS2 is just as important, but also a lot of the CRA, to my understanding, will build on NIS2. So it's like if you're in a good state with NIS2, you're going to be in a pretty good state with CRA. You won't be fully there, but at least sort of they will build it on each other, is my understanding.
Yeah, I think it's the other way, that there needs to points to CRA for product procurement and supply chain security. But yeah, they go hand in hand.
Hi, I came in a little late, so I can only say that the second half of your presentation was very good, but it was. And I have a bit of a question, so if you covered it already, please just shoot it down. But do you have any advice in how to maybe approach legal in maybe wanting to open source tools that you built in-house rather than bringing in open source?
Yeah, I think that's also a great question. I think to really answer that is so context dependent. It's like, why are they hesitant? I think understanding that pain point, then it's usually something that can be addressed. If they're hesitant because they think it will create a sort of legal or product liability for them, okay, then that's what you need to address with them. No, it's really not. If they think that no, it's our job just to say no to anything fun anyone wants to do, okay, then
That's kind of what I'm encountering, yeah.
But to be honest, I don't think that's actually what they think. I think they genuinely then perceive that there is some sort of risk perceived with that, or that it will lead to some disruption of company value, right? And the value part, that should be fairly easy to address in terms of like, no, the economics of this actually makes sense. And will actually either save money or be cost neutral and goodwill for us instead, and getting them to understand the economics of that. If it's genuinely about they perceiving some sort of risk in doing this, then it's sort of trying to get them to quantify what is actually the risk that you think we'll be facing here. What's the liability? And I think they will then, if they're being honest about it, rather quickly realize that there's not much risk to doing this, or that it might even be less of a risk to doing this than keeping it entirely proprietary in-house. But those would be sort of my first level attack points here, right? Like, understand what is their pain point and trying to address it. If their pain point is like, no, the specific tool, it contains like some very spicy trade secrets we don't want to give away, that's a lot harder to address, right? And then the right decision might be to not go open source with that particular thing, but obviously that can't be the case in every single thing you want to do, right? It should be the rare exception.
Okay. Thank you.
Any more questions? A final note, and I realized the other day when I spoke to lawyers that we had CMA, CRA, blah, blah, all these acronyms are excluding the lawyers or possibly us, I don't know. Thank you for coming in.
Thank you.